The year was 1881, and the land held its breath. It was a vast, tired expanse of Dakota prairie that gave little and took everything. On 160 acres of this unforgiving earth, the Western family was slowly losing a war they had never been equipped to fight. The sun was a merciless hammer, the wind a thief that stole the topsoil, and the silence was a weight, a physical presence that lived in the small, weathered cabin alongside Arthur, Martha, and their daughter, Cora. Cora carried the silence inside her. It had taken up residence in her throat 6 years prior, on the night she watched their first homestead in Ohio burn, the one with the green shutters and the climbing roses her mother had loved. She had screamed then, a single tearing sound as the roof gave way, and had not spoken a word since. The doctor in the next town over had called it a malady of the mind, a ghost in her throat that had stolen her voice. For her father, Arthur, it was another failure to add to the tally. For her mother, Martha, it was a sorrow so deep it had carved permanent lines from her eyes to her mouth. For Cora, it was simply the way things were. Her world was one of textures, smells, and the quiet language of watching. She was 17 now, with hands calloused from work that would make a grown man ache. Her life was a litany of chores, a rhythm of survival. She rose before the sun to milk their one bony cow, its milk thin and bluish. She fed the chickens that laid fewer eggs each week. She worked alongside her father in the cornfield, where the stalks were stunted and yellowed, their leaves rattling like dry bones in the ceaseless wind. Arthur rarely looked at her directly, his gaze always fixed on the horizon as if searching for a deliverance that never came. His shoulders were permanently stooped, not just from labor, but from the crushing weight of disappointment. Martha moved through their small cabin like a wraith, her hands twisting in her apron. She would speak to Cora in a low, constant murmur, filling the silence that her daughter could not. "We'll need to mend that fence post by the creek, Cora. The wind is worrying it loose. Or, if we can get just one more good rain, the beans might come in." They were prayers disguised as chores. Cora would simply nod, her eyes, a pale and watchful blue, conveying an understanding that required no sound. She knew her silence was a burden. She saw it in the way the townsfolk in Prairie Ridge looked at her, a mixture of pity and suspicion, the mute girl, the strange girl. She felt like a ghost in her own life, present but not entirely there, her only real contribution, the strength of her back. Their land bordered the sprawling territory of the Lakota. The Westerns saw them sometimes, small parties on horseback moving like a whisper along the ridgeline, their forms dark against the bleeding sunset. Arthur had warned her to keep her distance. "They're not hostile," he'd said, his voice rough as unsanded wood, "but we're on their land, even if the government says it's ours. We don't want trouble." It was not a statement of malice, but of caution born from weariness. They were too tired for trouble. And so a line existed, unseen but deeply felt, a boundary of culture and history that neither side crossed. On a sweltering afternoon in late August, when the air was thick as honey and the sky was a blank, searing white, Cora went down to the creek that marked this boundary. The family's meager vegetable patch was wilting, and she carried 2 wooden buckets, her arms straining, to bring back water. The creek was low, a silver ribbon of life in the parched land. As she knelt, dipping the first bucket into the cool, clear water, she heard a sound that did not belong to the prairie's soft cry of a newborn. She froze, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. Slowly, she raised her head. On the other side of the creek, under the shade of a lone cottonwood, sat a small group of Lakota. There was a warrior she recognized as their chief, a man with a strong, somber face named Chayton. Beside him sat a young woman, her black hair in 2 neat braids, cradling a swaddled infant. The baby's cry was small, but it pierced the heavy air. Cora remained perfectly still, hidden by the tall reeds, feeling as if she were intruding on a sacred moment. The woman, whose name she would later learn was Winona, gently rocked the child, murmuring to it in her own tongue. Suddenly, the peaceful scene shattered. A heavy, dead branch, weakened by rot and the unending sun, broke from the cottonwood with a loud crack. It crashed to the ground not 10 feet from them, striking a rotten log. The impact disturbed something hidden within the decaying wood. A low, menacing hum rose instantly, growing from a murmur to a roar. A dark, boiling cloud erupted from the Loga swarm of wild bees, enraged and defensive. Time seemed to splinter. The bees, a chaotic torrent of stinging fury, swirled in the air, their collective anger seeking a target. Cora saw Winona cry out, instinctively curling her body around her child, trying to shield him. Chaitan leaped to his feet, pulling a blanket from his horse, but the swarm was too fast, too frenzied. It was coalescing, a living weapon, and moving toward the most vulnerable thing, the heat and sound of the crying baby. In that fraction of a second, Cora did not think. She acted. Her 6 years of silence, of observing, of feeling like a useless shadow, fell away. She saw only the child, so small and helpless, and the terror on the mother's face. She dropped her bucket, snatched a handful of wild berries from a nearby bush, and crushed them in her palms. The sweet, sticky juice coated her hands. Then she stood up. She burst from the reeds, a pale, frantic figure against the drab landscape. She waved her arms, smearing the berry juice on her own face and neck. She made a guttural, desperate sound in the back of her throat, the first noise she had made in years, a raw, grating cry of pure will. It was enough. The sound, the sudden movement, the sweet scent it, drew the attention of the swarm's leaders. A few bees broke from the main cloud, then a dozen, then 100. They veered toward her. Chaitan, who had been about to swing the blanket, froze, his eyes locking on the settler girl. He saw the wild look in her eyes, the desperate purpose. She was offering herself as a sacrifice. Cora turned and ran. She did not run toward her home, but away from the creek, out into the open prairie, her bare feet flying over the hot, cracked earth. The hum followed her, a terrible halo of sound. The first sting felt like a hot needle plunged into her cheek, then another on her neck, a third on her eyelid. The pain was sharp, electric, but she pushed it down. She had to lead them far enough away. She could feel them in her hair, crawling on her skin. Her vision began to blur, not just from the venom, but from the sheer terror she refused to let consume her. The world became a kaleidoscope of pain and motion. The sun beat down, the ground flew beneath her, and the swarm was a living cloak, its vengeance focused entirely on her. She ran until her lungs burned like fire and her legs felt like lead. She stumbled, caught herself, and ran on. Behind her, Chaitan and his people could only watch in stunned disbelief. They saw the girl, a small figure dwindling in the distance, trailed by the dark cloud. They saw her deliberate, selfless act. She was drawing death away from his son, taking it into herself. A profound, unsettling stillness fell over their small party. The baby had stopped crying. Winona held him tight, her face pale with shock, her eyes fixed on the girl who was saving her child. Cora did not know how far she ran. A mile, maybe more. The stings were no longer individual points of agony, but a single consuming fire that covered her face, her neck, her arms. Her breath came in ragged, whistling sobs. Her left eye was swelling shut. Her throat, unused to even the slightest sound, felt raw and torn. Finally, her body could give no more. She tripped over a stone, her legs tangling beneath her, and fell hard into the dust and dry grass. The swarm, its fury partially spent, swirled around her for a moment longer before gradually dispersing, its hive too far away to return to, its immediate enemy vanquished. She lay there, face down in the dirt, the world a dim, roaring tunnel. Consciousness was a flickering candle flame. She felt a gentle hand on her shoulder and flinched. She tried to push herself up, but her limbs would not obey. Chaitan knelt beside her, his expression a mixture of awe and grave concern. He had followed her on foot, running faster than he had in years. He turned her over gently. Her face was a grotesque mask, swollen and red, dotted with the angry welts of the bee stings. Her lips were split, and one eye was nearly sealed. She was barely recognizable as the girl from the creek. He saw the track of a single tear through the dust on her cheek. He spoke in his own language, his voice low and filled with a respect that bordered on reverence. Another man, an elder with him, knelt and produced a small leather pouch. He mixed some dried herbs with saliva and gently began to daub the paste onto the worst of the stings. The mixture was cool and smelled of mint and damp earth. Cora whimpered, the sound small and lost. "We must take her back," Chaitan said in halting English, more to himself than to anyone else. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. Her head lolled against his chest. He began the long walk back, carrying the silent girl who had screamed for his son with her actions. When they reached the creek, Winona was waiting, her own eyes filled with tears. She reached out and touched Cora's hair, a gesture of profound gratitude. She looked at Chaitan, and in her gaze he saw the same understanding that was solidifying in his own heart. A debt had been incurred, a debt that honor demanded be paid. When Arthur Weston saw the Lakota chief walking toward his cabin, carrying his daughter's limp body, his blood ran cold. He grabbed the old rifle he kept mounted over the fireplace, his movements stiff with fear and anger. "Martha, get inside," he rasped. Martha appeared at the doorway, her face ashen. She saw Cora in the chief's arms and let out a choked cry, her hand flying to her mouth. Arthur stepped onto the porch, the rifle held loosely at his side, not aiming but ready. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice trembling with a father's primal fear. Chaitan stopped a few paces from the porch. He did not look at the rifle. His gaze was fixed on Arthur's face. "She is not harmed by us," he said, his English slow and deliberate. "She saved my son, the bees." He gestured with his head back toward the creek. Arthur's eyes flickered from Chaitan to his daughter's swollen, distorted face. He saw the stings then, dozens of them. The anger in him collapsed, replaced by a wave of confusion and horror. He lowered the rifle. Chaitan walked forward and gently placed Cora into her father's arms. Arthur staggered under the small weight of her, his own strength seeming to fail him. He looked down at her face, at the terrible price of her bravery, and a sound of pure anguish escaped his lips. He carried her inside and laid her on her cot. Martha was already there, wringing her hands, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, my child, my poor child," she wept, rushing to get a cool cloth and their small jar of lard, the only salve they had. Chaitan and his people stood outside for a moment, watching the frantic, sorrowful activity within the small cabin. Then, without another word, they turned and disappeared back across the creek, leaving the Westons to their grief and their daughter's pain. The next 2 days were a feverish haze for Cora. She drifted in and out of a painful sleep, her body aching, her face on fire. She was vaguely aware of her mother's constant presence, the cool cloths on her forehead, the small sips of water her father pressed to her swollen lips. In her waking moments, she heard their hushed, worried voices. The words were not for her, but for each other, whispers of despair that cut through her pain. "The plowshare, it's cracked clean through," she heard her father say one evening, his voice heavy with defeat. "I can't fix it. We can't turn the north field. That was our last chance for a winter crop." "Arthur, we can't worry about that now," her mother replied, her voice thin and frayed. "When else can we worry about it, Martha? When we're starving, when they come to take the land back. It's over. This place has beaten us." Cora closed her eyes, a fresh wave of pain washing over her, but this one was not from the bee stings. She had committed her great, silent act of courage, and for what? To lie helpless while her family's world crumbled around them. The sense of being a burden returned with a vengeance. She was just another mouth to feed, another problem her father could not solve, now more than ever. The heroism of her sacrifice curdled into a bitter feeling of futility. On the morning of the third day, Cora felt strong enough to sit up. The swelling on her face had begun to recede, though it was now a landscape of purple and yellow bruises. Her mother helped her to a chair by the open door, where she could feel the morning breeze. Her father was standing outside, staring at the broken plowshare that lay useless in the yard like the skeleton of some great, failed beast. The look on his face was one of complete desolation. It was then that Cora saw it first. A dust cloud on the horizon, coming from the direction of the Lakota lands. It was not a small cloud. It was large, growing steadily. Her father saw it too. He straightened up, his hand instinctively going to his side, as if reaching for the rifle he had left inside. Martha came to the doorway, her arm wrapping around Cora's shoulders. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. Fear was the first thought in all their minds, a misunderstanding, retribution. They watched as the dust cloud resolved into figures on horseback, and then people on foot following behind. It was not a war party, but it was nearly the entire village, dozens of people. They moved with a quiet, inexorable purpose, flowing over the prairie and across the creek as if the invisible boundary had never existed. At their head was Chaitin, his face stern but calm. He rode not a war pony but a sturdy workhorse. The men with him carried tool sacks, hoes, sturdy ropes. The women carried baskets laden with food, blankets, and tools for gardening. They did not stop at a distance. They came right into the Western's yard, their sheer numbers overwhelming the small, struggling farmstead. Arthur stood frozen, a statue of disbelief. Martha held Cora tighter. This was not an attack. It was something else, something so far beyond their comprehension that they could not even name it. Chaitin dismounted and walked directly to Arthur. He did not offer a greeting. He simply pointed to the broken plowshare. "This is iron?" he asked. Arthur could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. Chaitin turned and spoke to his men in their language. Two of them, strong men with scarred hands, went to the plow. They examined the break with an expert eye, discussing it in low tones. Then one of them went to a horse and returned with a heavy, metal forge tool that Arthur had only ever seen in a blacksmith shop. They began to work, their movements efficient and practiced. It was like a dam breaking. The rest of the tribe moved into action. A team of men with their own sturdy draft horses hitched them to a heavy wooden plow they had brought and began turning the hard, dry soil of the north field, the earth yielding to their strength where it had resisted Arthur's. Other men went to the sagging fence line and began resetting the posts, their axes ringing out in the morning air. The women flowed into Martha's wilting garden. They moved with an innate understanding of the earth, their hands pulling weeds, turning the soil around the struggling bean plants, and using water they had brought in large skins to give the thirsty roots a deep, life-giving drink. They began to sing softly as they worked, a low, rhythmic chant that was a prayer to the land itself. Winona, Chaitin's wife, detached from the group. In her arms, she carried her son, the child Cora had saved. She walked directly onto the porch where Cora sat with her mother. She stopped before them, her dark eyes soft with an emotion that needed no translation. She looked at Cora's bruised face, and her expression was one of profound empathy. She reached into a small pouch at her belt and brought out a container made from a hollowed gourd. Inside was a greenish, fragrant salve. She knelt before Cora, dipping her fingers into the salve. "For the brave one," she said softly, her English as careful as her husband's. She gently began to apply the cool, soothing balm to Cora's stings. It felt like water on a fire. The itching and burning that had tormented her for days began to subside almost instantly. As Winona worked, the baby in her arms gurgled happily, reaching out a tiny hand and brushing it against Cora's arm. Tears welled in Cora's eyes and streamed down her bruised cheeks. They were not tears of pain or sorrow. They were tears of overwhelming, incomprehensible gratitude. Martha was weeping silently beside her, her hand resting on her daughter's shoulder, a bridge of touch between the two mothers. All day they worked. The Lakota people transformed the Western farm. They moved with a shared purpose, a community in motion, a force of nature in their own right. They repaired what was broken, nurtured what was dying, and built what was needed. Arthur Weston stood in the middle of his yard for a long time, watching them, his face a mask of stunned humility. The pride that had been his heaviest burden, the pride that had kept him isolated in his failure, crumbled to dust. He eventually picked up a hammer and began to work alongside them, mending a loose board on the chicken coop, his movements clumsy at first, then surer, becoming a small part of the larger rhythm. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet, the work was done. The north field was plowed, a dark, fertile promise under the evening sky. The fence was strong, the garden was tended, and the broken plowshare had been skillfully mended, stronger than it was before. The Lakota gathered their tools, their movements as quiet and orderly as when they had arrived. Chayton approached Arthur again. He placed a hand on the mended plow. "A farm needs strong iron," he said. He then looked toward the cabin, his gaze finding Cora, who now stood in the doorway, her face glistening with the healing salve. "And a family needs a strong heart." He walked over to Cora. He did not smile, but his eyes held a deep, abiding respect. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder, a gesture that acknowledged her sacrifice, her strength. He looked at the girl who had no voice and saw the spirit that had spoken louder than any warrior's cry. Without another word, he turned, mounted his horse, and led his people away. They flowed back across the prairie, a silent, departing tide, leaving behind not just a repaired farm, but a world that had been irrevocably changed. In the quiet that followed, the silence felt different. It was not the heavy, oppressive silence of despair. It was a peaceful silence, filled with the scent of turned earth and the soft evening breeze. Arthur walked over to his wife and daughter. He looked at Martha, and she saw a light in his eyes that had been extinguished for years. Then he looked at Cora. For the first time in a long time, he truly saw her. He saw not the mute girl, not the burden, but the hero who had, in her own silent way, saved them all. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his rough farmer's hand infinitely tender. "My daughter," he said, his voice thick with emotion. It was all he needed to say. Weeks later, the corn in the north field stood tall and green. The bean vines in the garden were heavy with pods. Life on the farm was still hard, but it was no longer hopeless. The boundary between their land and the tribes had become a bridge. Sometimes a few Lakota women would appear to help Martha in the garden, sharing knowledge of wild herbs and resilient crops. Sometimes Arthur would find a brace of rabbits or a fish left on his porch, an unspoken gift. One afternoon, Cora was sitting on the porch steps, shelling beans into a large wooden bowl. She looked up and saw Winona walking toward the cabin, her son, now a healthy, curious baby, on her hip. She came alone, a friend visiting a friend. She sat on the step next to Cora, and they worked together in comfortable silence. After a while, the baby fussed. Cora reached into the bowl, picked out a perfect smooth bean, and held it out. The baby grasped it in his tiny fist, his fussing turning into a happy coo. Winona smiled at Cora, a smile of shared understanding. Cora smiled back. Her face still bore the faint, silvery traces of the worst stings, small scars that were not marks of damage, but medals of courage. She had not regained her voice, but she no longer needed to. She had learned that a person's worth was not measured in words, but in the silent language of the heart. In the vast, quiet prairie, under the endless sky, she had finally found her place. She was not the mute girl, she was Cora, and she was home.